Una donna cieca con un segreto incredibile affronta il giudizio spietato di un'intera città mentre lotta per salvare i suoi figli prima che sia troppo tardi. The sun rose lazily over Pineville, a small town in rural Tennessee, where time seemed to move slower than in the rest of the world. At Horizon Ranch, Lisa awoke to the singing of birds perched on her bedroom window, her eyes, devoid of vision, since birth couldn't capture the golden light that flooded the room, but her other senses compensated with a heightened perception of the world around her. "Edward," she called out, feeling the empty side of the bed. "I'm here, my love," replied a deep, gentle voice from the porch, "preparing our breakfast." Lisa smiled, getting up with the familiarity of someone who knew every inch of that space. Her fingers glided smoothly along the walls until she found the doorframe leading to the porch. The smell of fresh coffee and newly baked cheese biscuits filled her nostrils. "You always wake up too early," she commented, feeling the morning breeze caress her face. Edward approached, taking her hands in his. He was a 40-year-old man, with prematurely grey hair that gave him an air of wisdom. His touch was calloused, the result of years working in real estate that had earned him a considerable fortune. "I wanted to enjoy the morning before my meeting with the investors," he explained. "Besides, I know you have your daily appointment with Chief." At the mention of the buffalo's name, Lisa felt a warmth in her chest. Chief wasn't just an animal. He was a vital part of her history. A gift from her father when she was only 7. After her mother's death, the buffalo had become her silent confidant, her safe harbor in moments of solitude. After breakfast, Lisa walked along the stone path she knew by heart to the stable. The ranch workers had already begun their day, and she could hear the distant movement of tractors in the coffee fields. Lisa's world was built of sounds, textures, and aromas. "Good morning, Mrs. Lisa," greeted Josh, the ranch's longest-serving employee. "Chief's already restless waiting for you." "He always knows when I'm coming," she replied with a smile. Upon entering the stable, Lisa was greeted by Chief's characteristic snort. The animal, already elderly for his species, moved heavily toward her. She extended her hand and felt the buffalo's moist muzzle. "How are you today, my friend?" she whispered, caressing the rough fur of the animal. "I missed you." To an outside observer, the scene might have seemed strange, perhaps even disturbing. A blind woman talking to a buffalo as if it were a person. But for Lisa, that connection transcended common understanding. Chief had been her emotional guide during adolescence, when the limitations of her blindness seemed heavier. It was also beside him that she received the news of her father's death 10 years ago. And it was next to the buffalo that Edward proposed to her, respecting the special bond she maintained with the animal. "People in town still talk, you know," Lisa commented as she brushed Chief's fur. "They say it's strange for a woman of my position to spend so much time with an animal, but they don't understand, do they? You're my connection to the past, to my parents." The buffalo responded with a gentle movement of its head, as if understanding every word. Lisa smiled, feeling a sudden slight dizziness that made her lean on the animal. "I'm fine," she murmured, more to herself than to Chief. "Must be the heat." But it wasn't the first time she had felt that discomfort. In recent weeks, a strange sensation had been taking over her body. Morning sickness, unusual fatigue, and a perception that something was changing in her womb. When she returned to the main house, Edward had already left for his meetings. Alone, Lisa decided to rest on the living room sofa, where she ended up falling asleep. In her sleep, she dreamed of her mother, a nebulous figure she never knew, cradling her and singing a lullaby that seemed strangely familiar. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. Lisa woke with a start from her afternoon nap, with the unpleasant sensation of nausea rising in her throat. She rose hurriedly, feeling her way along the furniture until she found the path to the nearest bathroom. The following minutes were filled with intense discomfort until she finally caught her breath, leaning on the cool porcelain sink. "Mrs. Lisa, are you all right?" Connie's concerned voice, the housekeeper, sounded from the other side of the door. "Yes, Connie," she answered, trying to inject firmness into her trembling voice. Just a passing discomfort. But Lisa knew it wasn't something passing. For almost 2 months, these symptoms had been plaguing her. Initially, she attributed it to the intense heat that punished the region, but now she was beginning to suspect something more significant. With Connie's help, Lisa returned to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her sensitive fingers slid over her abdomen, detecting a subtle but undeniable protrusion. Her heart raced with the possibility forming in her mind. "Connie, what time is it?" she asked, feeling the housekeeper's face turned toward her. "Almost 4 in the afternoon, ma'am." "Mr. Edward called to say he'll be a little late in town. Seems the meeting with the investors has been extended." Lisa nodded, dismissing the housekeeper with a gentle smile. Alone again, she let tears silently stream down. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a complex emotion, a mixture of fear and hope. The idea of being pregnant had never completely abandoned Lisa's dreams, even with doctors warning about possible complications due to a congenital condition affecting her uterus. Edward, always protective, was reluctant to discuss the subject, fearing that a pregnancy could put his wife's health at risk. In the following weeks, it became impossible to hide the changes. Her belly grew at an alarming rate, disproportionate to the time of a normal pregnancy. Still, Lisa concealed her condition by wearing loose clothes and avoiding close contact with people in town. On a particularly hot morning, while Edward was in Nashville for a business meeting, Lisa decided to visit Chief earlier than usual. The buffalo, as if sensing something different, approached her with unusual gentleness. "You can tell, can't you?" whispered Lisa, guiding the animal's head to her voluminous belly. "There's life growing in here." The buffalo emitted a low sound, almost a groan, and Lisa felt an inexplicable connection between the animal and what was growing inside her. It was at that moment, under the rising sun of Pineville, that she decided to tell Edward the truth. As soon as he returned. The next evening, when her husband finally returned from his trip, Lisa received him on the house porch. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, while cicadas sang their nocturnal symphony. "I missed you," said Edward, embracing her. Immediately, he noticed something different. His body stiffened as he felt his wife's protruding belly against his own body. "Lisa, what—" "We need to talk," she interrupted, holding Edward's strong hands between her own. "There's something important I need to tell you." That night, sitting in the living room under the dim light of antique lamps, Lisa revealed her suspicions. Edward oscillated between surprise, contained joy, and deep concern. "How far along do you think you are?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sure, but by my calculations, no more than 2.5 months, replied Lisa, feeling the mismatch between her account and the size of her belly. Edward placed his trembling hand on his wife's womb and, as if in response, felt a vigorous movement. "My God, Lisa," he exclaimed, withdrawing his hand as if he had received a shock. "This doesn't seem normal for a pregnancy of a few months." The concern in Edward's voice was palpable, and Lisa felt fear infiltrate her moment of joy. "First thing tomorrow, we're going to the doctor," Edward declared, in a tone that admitted no argument. "Dr. Samuel needs to examine you immediately." Lisa nodded in silence. Behind her sightless eyes, a storm of emotions was forming. There was something inexplicable about her pregnancy, a sensation that surpassed rational understanding. While Edward planned the trip to the doctor, detailing each step as he did in his business, Lisa let her mind wander to the stable, where Chief rested under stars she had never seen, but had always felt guiding her path. Dr. Samuel Parker's office was the most respected in Pineville. Located in a restored mansion on the central square, the place exuded a discreet confidence that attracted both local inhabitants and people from neighboring towns. That morning, the doctor had reserved the first appointment exclusively for Lisa and Edward. "It's been a while since I've seen you," remarked the doctor, a 60-year-old man with completely white hair and perceptive eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Immediately, he realized his slip. "Forgive me, Lisa, force of habit." "Don't worry, doctor," she replied with a calm smile. "I understand perfectly what you meant." Dr. Samuel was a long-time friend of the family. He had cared for Lisa's father in his final days and monitored her health since childhood. He knew every detail of her congenital condition, and therefore the expression of surprise on his face upon seeing the prominent volume of Lisa's belly did not go unnoticed by Edward. After a series of preliminary questions about symptoms, the doctor asked Lisa to lie on the examination table for a physical exam. His experienced fingers gently palpated her abdomen, but with each touch his brow furrowed more. "How long exactly have you noticed the first changes?" he questioned, looking alternately at Lisa and Edward. "Approximately 2.5 months," replied Lisa, as the doctor made notes in her chart. "At first I thought it was just water retention, but soon realized it was something more." Dr. Samuel nodded, turning on the ultrasound machine beside the examination table. The cold gel spread over Lisa's skin caused her to shiver, followed by the sensation of the probe sliding over her belly. The silence that followed was broken only by the pulsating sound emanating from the machine. Edward, standing beside his wife, squeezed her hand firmly while observing the monitor screen. "My God," murmured the doctor, adjusting his glasses as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What is it, doctor?" Edward's voice came out strangled. "Is something wrong with the baby?" Dr. Samuel cleared his throat, moving the probe to different angles before responding. "It's not a baby, Edward. It's two." Lisa felt a wave of emotion course through her body. Twins. The possibility had never crossed her mind, but it explained the accelerated growth of her belly. The relief, however, was brief. The doctor's expression, which Edward described to her in a whisper, indicated concern. "The fetuses present an unusual development," explained Dr. Samuel, choosing his words carefully. "For the gestational time you report, they are considerably larger than they should be." "Is that dangerous?" asked Lisa, feeling a knot form in her throat. The doctor turned off the machine before answering, removing his gloves with a snap that echoed through the silent room. "We need to conduct more detailed examinations. I'll refer you to a specialist in Memphis. This pregnancy presents characteristics that are out of the ordinary." On the way home, the silence inside the car was as dense as fog. Edward drove with his eyes fixed on the road, while Lisa absorbed the information received, instinctively caressing the womb where her children were growing in a mysterious manner. "Twins, Edward," she finally said, trying to break the tension. "I always dreamed of having a large family." Edward covered Lisa's hand with his, briefly. "So, did I, my love? But I can't deny that I'm worried." Dr. Samuel seemed disconcerted. Lisa agreed with a sigh. There was something more in the doctor's tone, an unformulated question that hung in the air. Arriving at the ranch, they were received by Connie, who immediately perceived the charged atmosphere between the couple. "Any news, bosses?" she questioned, while serving tea on the porch. "We're expecting twins," announced Lisa, unable to contain the news. Connie's eyes widened, alternating between Lisa's voluminous belly and Edward's tense face. "What a blessing, Mrs. Lisa," exclaimed the housekeeper, but her joy sounded forced. "I'll prepare a special tea for you. My grandmother always said that chamomile with cinnamon is excellent for pregnant women." When Connie moved away, Edward finally verbalized what had been bothering him since the consultation. "Lisa, is there something you're not telling me?" he asked in a low and controlled voice. "Dr. Samuel asked strange questions about your routine, about your habits. He seemed to be looking for some alternative explanation for the accelerated development of the babies." Lisa felt the blood freeze in her veins. The doctor's questions about her relationship with the ranch animals, especially with Chief, had sounded innocent at the time, but now they acquired a disturbing meaning. "What exactly are you suggesting, Edward?" Her voice came out firmer than she expected. "I'm not suggesting anything," he quickly replied. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening. This pregnancy isn't normal, Lisa. And Dr. Samuel's questions about Chief, why would he be so interested in your buffalo?" The news of Lisa's pregnancy spread through Pineville with the speed of a wildfire in dry brush. In a small town, where days passed at a slow pace and extraordinary events were scarce, the unusual pregnancy of the wife of the richest man in the region became the main topic of conversation in the municipal market circles, in the bakery line, and after Sunday masses. They say her belly grew overnight, commented Mrs. Eunice, the owner of the local pharmacy, while organizing medications on the shelves. My cousin Jane, who works at Dr. Samuel's house, said he was in shock when he saw the ultrasound, replied Mr. Anthony, lowering his voice as if sharing a state secret. Seems like there's something wrong with the children. Jane, the young cashier of the establishment who was listening to the conversation attentively, couldn't resist adding, "Have you seen how she treats that buffalo? Spends more time with the beast than with people. That's not normal." Jane's words hung in the air for a few seconds before Mrs. Eunice reprimanded her with a severe look. But the seed was planted, and in a few days, distorted versions of the comment began to circulate around the town, gaining grotesque proportions. In C. Mr. Gerald's barbershop, frequented by the male elite of Pineville, the speculations acquired even darker tones. "Edward is a decent man. He doesn't deserve this situation," declared August Montgomery, owner of the largest car dealership in the region, while receiving a haircut. "The whole town knows that Lisa has eccentric behavior." "The blindness was never a problem," added another client, a lawyer newly arrived in town. "But this obsession with the buffalo always seemed disturbing to me, now with this mysterious pregnancy." Mr. Gerald, who had known Lisa since she was a child and held a special affection for the young woman, abruptly interrupted the conversation. "You should be ashamed," he exclaimed, scissors in hand, "inventing stories about an honorable woman just because she has an attachment to an animal that represented comfort in the difficult childhood she had." The embarrassed silence that followed was brief. As soon as Mr. Gerald moved away to attend to another client, the whispers resumed, now more cautious but equally malicious. Meanwhile, at Horizon Ranch, Edward faced his own internal battles. Dr. Samuel's insinuations about the possible origin of the abnormal pregnancy had planted a seed of doubt in his heart. Not that he distrusted Lisa's fidelity, he knew his wife's integrity, but the inexplicable nature of the situation tormented him. That afternoon, Edward decided to visit the stable alone. Chief, the elderly buffalo, rested in a corner, chewing hay with characteristic placidity. The animal raised its head when it sensed Edward's approach, but soon returned to its meal, showing no particular interest in the visitor. "What is there between you and my wife?" murmured Edward, immediately feeling ridiculous for talking to an animal. Still, he continued, "She loves you in a way I've never fully understood." Chief stared at him with gentle, almost human eyes in their expressiveness. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in the buffalo's gaze, an intelligence, that transcended what was expected from a common animal. "This is madness," he said to himself, moving away from the stable with hurried steps. Upon returning to the main house, he found Lisa sitting on the porch, caressing her prominent belly while rocking in her father's old rocking chair. "Where were you?" she asked, turning her face in the direction of her husband's footsteps. "Just walking around the property," replied Edward, avoiding mentioning his visit to the stable. "How are you feeling today?" "The babies are very active," smiled Lisa, guiding Edward's hand to her womb. "Feel that? They seem to be dancing." Edward felt the vigorous movements under the stretched skin, and for a moment all doubts and concerns dissipated. Those were his children, regardless of the mysterious circumstances surrounding their conception. The tender moment was interrupted by the arrival of Josh, the ranch foreman, with a concerned expression. "Boss, sorry to disturb, but there's a situation in town that you should know about." Edward stepped away a few paces from Lisa, conversing in a low voice with the employee. However, not far enough to prevent her from catching fragments of the conversation. Comments about Mrs. Lisa, insinuations at the store, the buffalo. When Josh withdrew, the silence between the couple was as palpable as dense fog. "What did he say?" asked Lisa with a trembling voice. Edward hesitated, but knew there was no point in hiding the truth. "The whole town is talking about your pregnancy, Lisa, and they're not just speculations about the twins. There are insinuations about your relationship with Chief." Lisa's hands instinctively flew to protect her womb, as if she could shield the babies from the slander. "What kind of insinuations?" she asked, though she already intuited the answer. "The worst possible," replied Edward, sitting beside her and holding her hands firmly. "But it doesn't matter what they say. We're stronger than this." Lisa nodded. In silence, but in her heart, she knew the situation was much more complex than Edward imagined. The rumors were just the beginning. The worst was yet to come, and she could feel this with the same clarity with which she perceived the change of seasons by the scent of the air. The University Hospital in Memphis rose imposingly against the blue sky of the Tennessee capital. Lisa and Edward had left Pineville at dawn that day, following Dr. Samuel's recommendation to consult Dr. Richard Wells, a specialist in high-risk pregnancies and a renowned professor at the School of Medicine. During the 3-hour journey, the couple exchanged few words. Edward concentrated on the winding road that cut through the interior of the state, while Lisa kept her hands on her womb, feeling the increasingly vigorous movements of the twins. "We're almost there," announced Edward, breaking the prolonged silence. "How are you feeling?" "A bit tired," replied Lisa, adjusting herself in the passenger seat. "And apprehensive, to be honest. I don't know what to expect from this consultation." Edward extended his hand to hold hers, in a gesture that tried to convey a confidence he himself didn't completely feel. "Dr. Richard is the best in the field. If anyone can understand what's happening, it's him." Upon arriving at the hospital, they were received by a team already alerted about the peculiar case. A middle-aged nurse with a gentle voice and kind hands led Lisa through long corridors to a special examination room, while Edward filled out forms at the reception. Dr. Richard Wells didn't correspond to the mental image Lisa had constructed. His voice was surprisingly young for someone with so much academic prestige, and his touch, when greeting her, revealed hands without the marks of time she expected. "Mrs. Morgan, it's a pleasure to meet you," said the doctor, guiding her to a comfortable chair. "Dr. Samuel briefed me on some details of your case, but I'd like to hear from you yourself how this pregnancy has been." Lisa recounted the events of the last few months. The first symptoms, the accelerated growth of her belly, the intense movements, even the recurring dreams with her deceased mother. Dr. Richard listened attentively, interrupting only to ask specific questions about her previous health. When Edward finally joined them, the doctor had already prepared the equipment for a series of detailed examinations. "Let's start with a 3-dimensional ultrasound," he explained, applying the gel to Lisa's belly. "This equipment will give us much more detailed images of the fetuses." The rhythmic sound of the twins' heartbeats filled the room, bringing tears to Lisa's eyes. Edward, observing the monitor, couldn't hide his astonishment at the clear images that appeared. "They seem different," he commented, unable to contain the observation. Dr. Richard nodded, moving the probe with surgical precision to capture different angles. "Indeed, we're observing some unusual characteristics in the formation of the fetuses," confirmed the doctor, with a professional tone that masked his own perplexity, "especially in the cranial structure of the first twin and in the conformation of the limbs of the second." "Does that mean they have some disability?" asked Lisa, with a voice choked by fear. The doctor turned off the device before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I wouldn't classify it as a disability, Mrs. Morgan. What we see are morphological variations that deviate from the usual pattern of human fetal development. We'll need to conduct other tests to better understand what's happening." The following hours transformed into a blur of medical procedures, blood collections, imaging, tests and endless questionnaires about the family history of both. Exhausted, Lisa was finally led to a private waiting room while Edward and Dr. Richard conversed privately. In the corridor adjacent to the room where Lisa waited, Edward faced the disconcerting reality presented by the specialist. "Mr. Morgan, we're facing a case without precedent in medical literature," declared Dr. Richard, displaying the images on his tablet. "The fetuses present characteristics that don't fit into standard human development." "What exactly does that mean?" questioned Edward, feeling his throat dry. "It means there's a significant genetic anomaly," replied the doctor, sliding his finger across the screen to show details of the images. He observed this cranial structure, The formation of the spine, the arrangement of the limbs. There are elements that suggest a genetic influence. Not human. Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The insinuations circulating in Pineville suddenly gained a terrifying dimension in his mind. "Doctor, what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice almost inaudible. Dr. Richard adjusted his glasses, uncomfortable with his own conclusion. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Morgan. I'm merely reporting what the tests indicate. But I need to ask a delicate question. Does your wife have frequent contact with animals?" The question hit Edward like a physical blow. Lisa's daily visits to the stable, her inexplicable connection with Chief, the town rumors, everything mixed in a disturbing whirlwind. "She has a buffalo, a pet, since childhood," he responded mechanically. "But what does that have to do with—" "We need to do some more tests," interrupted the doctor, avoiding the direct question. "There's another important factor we've detected. Your wife has a mass in her uterus, adjacent to the fetuses. Initially, we thought it was a fibroid, but the detailed analysis suggests characteristics of a neoplasm." "A tumor?" Edward turned, pale. "Is it serious?" "Potentially, yes. The mass is growing rapidly and may be related to the abnormal development of the fetuses. We'll need to monitor closely and consider intervention if it poses a risk to Mrs. Morgan's life." Edward nodded, stunned by the volume of disturbing information. When he returned to the room where Lisa was waiting, he found her with a serene face, oblivious to the devastating revelations. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The journey back to Pineville proceeded in a silence as dense as fog. Edward drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his mind filled with dark thoughts he couldn't or didn't want to share with Lisa. She, in turn, had allowed herself to be lulled by the car's movement, sleeping for most of the trip, exhausted by the medical procedures and the emotional tension of the day. Occasionally, Edward shifted his gaze from the road to observe his sleeping wife's profile. The golden light of dusk bathed her serene face, contrasting with the undeniably abnormal protrusion of her womb. How could he tell her the truth? How to explain that the beings growing inside her were not entirely human, according to medical science? And even more devastating, how to reveal the existence of the tumor threatening her life? Dr. Richard had been clear in his recommendations. Lisa would need to return to Memphis in 2 weeks for further tests and, possibly, to discuss an emergency. A surgical procedure, if the tumor continued to grow at its current rate. The pregnancy, already complex in itself, was becoming a potentially fatal risk. "Edward." Lisa's sleepy voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are we almost home?" "Almost," he replied, forcing a carefree tone. "About 20 more minutes." Lisa adjusted herself in the seat, instinctively bringing her hands to her womb. "They're agitated." "Today," she commented with a smile. "I think the trip made them restless." Edward swallowed hard, unable to respond. Each movement Lisa attributed to the twins could, in fact, be a manifestation of the tumor's growth. The line between the life she carried and the threat to her own existence was becoming dangerously thin. "What did the doctor say while I was resting?" asked Lisa, as if she could read his thoughts. "I know you talked privately." Edward hesitated, seeking words that could soften the truth without transforming it into a complete lie. He confirmed they're twins, he began cautiously, and that they present some particularities in their development. "What kind of particularities?" "Unusual bone structures mainly," he answered, omitting the doctor's most alarming conclusions. "We'll need to go back in 2 weeks for follow-up." Lisa nodded, silent for a few seconds before asking, "He mentioned something about my connection with Chief, didn't he?" The question hit Edward like a physical blow. How could she know? "Why do you say that?" he questioned, trying to keep his voice steady. "Because I'm not naive, Edward," replied Lisa with surprising calmness. "The whispers in town, Dr. Samuel's strange questions, your emotional distance in recent weeks. I know there's something everyone suspects, but no one has the courage to say openly." Edward slowed the car, parking on the shoulder of the deserted road. He needed to face this conversation with his full attention. "Lisa, you need to understand that these suspicions are absurd," he declared, holding his wife's hands between his. "No one really believes that you and Chief—" His voice failed, unable to complete the sentence. "That Chief and I have some kind of relationship?" she completed, with a frankness that disconcerted him. "Of course we don't. In the sense they insinuate. But there's a connection between us that goes beyond what ordinary people can understand. Since childhood, I've felt there's something special about him, something almost human." Edward observed his wife's face, looking for signs of delirium or confusion, but found only the characteristic serenity he had always admired in her. "What exactly are you saying, Lisa?" She sighed deeply before answering. "My father used to tell stories about Chief, about how he arrived at our ranch in a mysterious way, shortly before my mother's death. He said there was something magical about the animal, a presence that transcended its nature. At the time, I believed it was just a tale to console a child who had just lost her mother, but over the years—" Her voice faded, lost in old memories. Edward took the moment to regain control of the situation. "Lisa, we need to focus on what's real now," he said firmly. "Dr. Richard found something beyond the babies during the exams." Lisa's countenance changed instantly, tranquility replaced by apprehension. "What did he find?" "A mass in your uterus. It could be a tumor." The words hung between them like a sentence. Lisa brought her hands to her womb, as if trying to protect her children from an invisible threat. "Is it serious?" she finally asked. "Potentially, yes," replied Edward, deciding on honesty. He believes the tumor may be growing along with the pregnancy, at an accelerated rate. That's why we need to go back in 2 weeks. "And the babies?" Edward hesitated. How to explain that the babies were part of the problem, that their anomalous formations might be directly linked to the tumor's growth? "The babies are stable for now," he answered vaguely. But the doctor expressed concern about continuing the pregnancy, considering the presence of the tumor. "He suggested terminating the pregnancy," concluded Lisa, "not as a question, but as a painful realization." "As a possibility, yes," admitted Edward, "to prioritize your health." Lisa slowly shook her head, determination emerging in her countenance. "I won't give them up, Edward. Whatever the risk, these babies are our children. I feel this with every fiber of my being." Edward restarted the car's engine, unable to argue against his wife's unshakable conviction. On the horizon, Pineville's first lights began to twinkle, announcing both the proximity of home and new challenges that would test the limits of love and understanding. The library and Horizon Ranch's main house had remained practically untouched since Lisa's father's death. Massive wooden shelves lined the walls, supporting old volumes that accumulated dust and memories in equal proportion. It was a room Edward rarely frequented, respecting Lisa's request to keep the space as her father had left it. That morning, however, while Lisa rested under Connie's care, Edward felt compelled to seek answers in the relics of the past. If there was any explanation for the mystery surrounding the relationship between his wife and Chief, perhaps it was hidden among his late father-in-law's belongings. "Need any help, sir?" asked Josh, surprised to find Edward rummaging through the dusty shelves. "No, thank you. Just looking for some old documents," replied Edward, avoiding details. Josh hesitated at the door for a few moments before adding, "If you're looking for Colonel Williams' diaries, they're kept in the cedar box behind the desk." Edward raised his eyes, surprised. "How do you know I'm looking for the diaries?" An enigmatic smile appeared on the old foreman's wrinkled face. "Because it's the only place where you'll find answers about Chief and Mrs. Clare, Lisa's mother." The comment left Edward intrigued. Josh had worked at the ranch for more than 40 years, had been Colonel Williams' right-hand man, and had practically seen Lisa born. If anyone knew the family's secrets, it was him. "What do you know about this, Josh?" he asked, abandoning his search to face the employee. The old man sighed, closing the library door behind him. "I only know what I saw, boss, and I saw strange things on this ranch, things town folks wouldn't understand." "What kind of things?" Josh approached, lowering his voice as if fearing being overheard. "Mrs. Clare, God rest her soul, was very sick after Mrs. Lisa was born. The doctors gave no hope. That's when the colonel brought Chief to the ranch. The buffalo. At the time, he was just a calf, clarified Josh. The colonel brought him after a trip up north, said the animal had healing powers, that it would save his wife. Edward frowned, skeptical. Healing powers? That's superstition, Josh. Maybe it is, boss, but after the calf arrived, Mrs. Clare improved for a few months. It was like a miracle. She would spend hours with the animal, caressing it, talking to it as if conversing with a person. The description was disturbingly similar to Lisa's behavior with the same animal decades later. What happened afterward? Asked Edward, fearing the answer. Mrs. Clare ended up passing away anyway, replied Josh, with sorrow in his voice. But not before asking the colonel to leave the buffalo for her daughter, who was only 2 years old at the time. She said that part of her would live on in the animal, that he would protect Lisa when she could no longer be present. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. The story sounded like a folk legend, the kind of narrative that proliferated in rural America, mixing faith, superstition, and inexplicable events. Did the colonel believe this? Not at first, confessed Josh. But over time, he too began to notice something different about the animal. The way Chief protected the girl, how he seemed to understand everything happening around him. It wasn't normal behavior for a buffalo. With a nod, Josh indicated the cedar box. It's all in the diaries, boss. The colonel recorded every detail. He was an educated man, tried to seek scientific explanations, even consulted researchers from the city. But in the end, he accepted that there are things in this world that science still can't explain. After Josh's departure, Edward opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, he found 6 hardcover notebooks, meticulously dated. He started with the oldest, which coincided with the period mentioned by Josh. The first pages described the colonel's anguish over his wife's terminal illness and his desperation to find a cure. On a trip to Montana, he had heard stories about a buffalo breeder whose animals possessed mystical properties. Driven more by desperation than belief, the colonel had traveled there and returned with a calf. As he advanced in his reading, Edward found increasingly disturbing accounts. Claire, already very debilitated, insisting on spending hours with the animal. Incomprehensible conversations between her and the buffalo. And finally, a ritual described in detail on a full moon night when Claire, apparently in a trance, recited words in an unknown language while holding the calf. I can't explain what I witnessed tonight, the colonel had written. Claire seemed like a different person, speaking in a language I've never heard. When I questioned her, she only said she was ensuring that part of her would remain to care for our daughter. The following pages related Claire's sudden improvement, followed by a period of apparent remission of the disease, but the most impressive were the observations about the buffalo's behavior, which demonstrated intelligence far beyond its species. Today, Chief opened Lisa's bedroom door using his muzzle and alerted the nanny that the girl had a fever. How could an animal perceive this? How would it know it needed to call for help? Edward closed the diary, feeling nauseated. The implications of those accounts were too disturbing to assimilate at once. If what the colonel had written was true, then Chief wasn't just a pet. He was a vessel for something more, something possibly related to Lisa's mother. And now his wife carried in her womb beings that, according to doctors, presented non-human characteristics. The connection was impossible to ignore, however absurd it might seem. A light knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Connie with a worried expression. "Mr. Edward, Mrs. Lisa is calling for you. She's not feeling well." Edward hurriedly put the diary back in the box and ran to the bedroom, leaving behind the revelations of the past, but carrying with him the doubts that now consumed him from within. Lisa's health deteriorated with each passing day. What had begun as occasional discomforts had transformed into constant pain, interspersed with episodes of extreme weakness that left her bedridden for hours. Edward watched, helpless, as his wife withered before his eyes, still adamantly refusing to consider any procedure that might put the babies at risk. That morning, especially hot for April, Lisa had insisted on being taken to the stable. Edward had been reluctant, but faced with his wife's unwavering determination, he had eventually given in. Only 15 minutes, he had stipulated, helping her sit in an improvised wheelchair. And only if Josh and I are with you the whole time. Lisa had nodded without strength to argue the conditions. Her face, once radiant, now exhibited a worrying pallor, contrasting with the enormous volume of her womb, which seemed to grow in inverse proportion to her general health. The journey to the stable, normally done in a few minutes, seemed endless. Each bump on the stone path drew muffled groans from Lisa, who tried to disguise her discomfort by biting her lips until they almost bled. When they finally arrived, Chief was already waiting for them. The elderly buffalo, as if sensing Lisa's arrival, had positioned itself near the entrance, its eyes fixed on the direction from which they would come. Edward couldn't help but notice the unusual behavior of the animal, so coincident with the accounts in his father-in-law's diaries. "Can you leave me alone with him, please?" asked Lisa as soon as they approached the buffalo. "Absolutely not," replied Edward categorically. "You're too weak, and if you need help—" "Edward," she interrupted with surprising firmness in her condition. "I need this moment. It's important for me and for our children. Please trust me, just 5 minutes." There was something in Lisa's tone, a solemn determination, that made Edward step back. He exchanged a look with Josh, who nodded slightly. 5 minutes, Edward. Agreed. We'll be right outside, within earshot. When the two men moved away, Lisa brought the wheelchair closer to the buffalo. Chief lowered his head, gently touching his muzzle to her swollen belly, as if recognizing what was growing inside. "You know, don't you?" whispered Lisa, caressing the animal's head. "You know who they are." The buffalo emitted a low sound, almost a moan, which Lisa interpreted as confirmation. "I'm dying, Chief," she continued, the words flowing with frightening naturalness. "The doctor didn't say it explicitly, but I know how to recognize the truth in the silences. This tumor is consuming me, and there's no way to save both me and the babies." Silent tears streamed down Lisa's face as she shared with the buffalo what she hadn't had, the courage to verbalize to her husband. "Tomorrow we'll return to Memphis. The doctors want to terminate the pregnancy. They say it's the only chance to save me. Edward agrees with them, though he doesn't have the courage to pressure me directly." Chief pressed his muzzle against Lisa's trembling hands in an almost human gesture of consolation. "But I can't do that," she continued, her voice choked with emotion. "I can't give them up. Somehow I know these babies are special, that they have a purpose. I feel this in the depths of my being." Lisa leaned closer to the buffalo as if sharing a secret. "I found my father's diaries, you know. I read about my mother, about you, about the ritual. I know she's in you somehow, and now part of her will be in my children." The buffalo remained perfectly still, its eyes fixed on Lisa's, establishing a connection that transcended verbal communication. "I've made my decision, Chief. I'll proceed with the pregnancy no matter the cost. These babies will be born, even if I'm not here to see them grow." Outside the stable, Edward nervously consulted his watch. The 5 minutes had extended to 10, and his anxiety increased with each second. Finally, unable to wait any longer, he signaled to Josh and both returned to the stable's interior. They found Lisa with her head resting against Chief's neck, her eyes closed, and an expression of peace that Edward hadn't seen in weeks. For a terrifying moment he feared the worst, but soon realized she was merely sleeping, exhausted by the emotional and physical effort. "Let's take her back to the house," he whispered to Josh, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. Hearing her husband's voice, Lisa slowly opened her eyes. Her face exhibited a disconcerting serenity, as if she had reached a resolution after a long internal conflict. "Thank you for giving me this moment," she said, as Edward adjusted the wheelchair for the return to the house. "How do you feel?" he asked, noticing something different in her countenance. "At peace," replied Lisa simply, "finally at peace with my decision." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. There was something definitive in Lisa's tone, something that suggested an irrevocable choice. Back at the main house, after settling Lisa in the bed of the master bedroom, Edward withdrew to his office. He called Dr. Richard in Memphis, needing to confirm the preparations for their return the next day. "Doctor, what are the real chances if we opt for terminating the pregnancy?" he asked, keeping his voice low so Lisa couldn't hear from the other room. The doctor's response came laden with professional hesitation. "Mr. Morgan, I need to be honest. Even with termination, the prognosis isn't favorable. The tumor has grown significantly since our last consultation, according to the tests Dr. Samuel sent us yesterday. We're talking about a palliative intervention, not curative." The words hit Edward like a physical blow. Even sacrificing the babies, the chances of saving Lisa were minimal. "And if we proceed with the pregnancy?" "In that case, the additional strain on her body will probably accelerate the process. We're talking weeks, maybe days." Edward thanked him mechanically and hung up the phone, feeling numb. The cruel reality finally imposed itself. There was no way out without loss. When he returned to the bedroom, he found Lisa sitting on the bed, surprisingly alert, writing something in a notebook. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure after the devastating phone conversation. "Writing some instructions," she replied with a calmness that disconcerted him. "For when I'm no longer here." "Lisa, don't talk like that. Tomorrow we'll be in Memphis and the doctors—" "We're not going to Memphis, Edward," she interrupted, closing the notebook. "I've made my decision. I'm going to have these babies here in our home." Edward sat heavily on the edge of the bed, trying to process what he was hearing. "That's madness. You need specialized medical care. The tumor will take me anyway," Lisa completed, with an acceptance that frightened him. "I talked with Dr. Samuel this afternoon while you were in the office. He was honest with me, more than you've been." The blow was direct. Edward had tried to protect her from the complete truth, softening the severity of her condition. "Lisa, I just wanted to—" "I know, my love." She extended her hand to touch her husband's face. "I know you wanted to spare me, but I need to face this with clarity, without illusions. The babies are my priority now. They will live even if I can't be here to see them grow." Tentar novamente. The house was immersed in an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the constant ticking of the wall clock in the main living room. Sitting at the kitchen table, Edward contemplated his untouched cup of coffee, while outside the sky began to brighten with the first light of morning. The 2 weeks following Lisa's decision had passed in an anguishing routine. She, confined to the bedroom, fighting daily against intensifying pain. He, divided between respect for his wife's choice and the despair of watching her wither before his eyes, sought comfort in his late father-in-law's diaries, trying to find some logic, some explanation for the inexplicable. A noise at the back door pulled him from his dark thoughts. It was Josh, with the grave expression that had become habitual in recent weeks. "Good morning, boss," greeted the foreman, removing his hat as a sign of respect. "How was the night?" "She managed to sleep a few hours," replied Edward, rubbing, his eyes red from fatigue. "Connie is with her now." Josh nodded, hesitating before continuing. "Chief has been restless since yesterday. Hasn't eaten, hasn't drunk water, keeps pacing back and forth in the stable, snorting as if sensing something." Edward raised his eyes, suddenly alert. In recent weeks, it had become impossible to ignore the buffalo's almost supernatural behavior, so coincidental with the deteriorations in Lisa's health. "What do you think that means?" Josh replaced his hat, uncomfortable with the direct question. "I'm not a man of superstitions, boss, but I've seen this behavior before, on the day Mrs. Clare passed away. The animal knew somehow, knew before any of us." The implication hung in the air, heavy as lead. Edward rose abruptly, knocking over the cup that shattered on the tiled floor. "Go to town, get Dr. Samuel immediately. Tell him it's urgent." As Josh hurriedly left to fulfill the order, Edward climbed the stairs toward the master bedroom, seized by a dark premonition. Opening the door, he found Connie seated beside the bed where Lisa rested, apparently asleep. "How is she?" he whispered, approaching cautiously. "She fell asleep a little while ago, sir," replied the housekeeper, rising to give Edward her place. "She was in a lot of pain but refused to take the medications. said she needed to be conscious for... The incomplete phrase hung between them. For the birth of the babies, for her final moments, the possibilities were equally terrifying. Edward sat on the edge of the bed observing his wife's pale face. Despite the disease consuming her, there was a serenity in her features that contrasted with the agony of recent days. "Can you leave? Us alone for a few minutes?" he asked the housekeeper, who silently withdrew. Alone with Lisa, Edward allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. Tears he had contained for weeks finally escaped, falling onto his wife's interlaced hands. "Don't leave me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how to continue without you." To his surprise, Lisa's fingers moved slightly under his. "Edward?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," he replied, quickly wiping away the tears. "How do you feel?" A slight smile appeared on Lisa's dry lips. "It's today," she said simply. "What?" "The babies. They're coming today," she explained, with a certainty that disconcerted Edward. "I can feel it. They're ready." The calmness with which she made the announcement contrasted dramatically with the panic that took hold of Edward. The predicted date for delivery was still weeks away, even considering the accelerated development of the pregnancy. "I'm going to call Dr. Samuel," he declared, standing up. "Josh has already gone to get him." "There won't be time," replied Lisa, holding her husband's arm with surprising firmness. "I need you to take me to Chief." "To the Buffalo? Lisa, you need a doctor, not—" "Please, Edward," she interrupted, with iron determination in her fragile voice. "It's important. He's part of this. He always has been." Edward hesitated, divided, between the urgency to seek medical help and the desire to fulfill what could be his wife's last request. "Let me at least call Connie to accompany us." Lisa nodded, already trying to rise with visible effort. The pain on her face was evident, but there was also a resolution that Edward dared not contest. With the housekeeper's help, they managed to take Lisa to the stable, using the same wheelchair from previous weeks. The journey, conducted at a slow pace to minimize discomfort, seemed endless. When they finally arrived, they found Chief in a state of extreme agitation. The elderly buffalo moved restlessly in its space, snorting and pawing the ground with its hooves, behavior completely atypical for the normally placid animal. Upon seeing Lisa, however, the buffalo immediately calmed. It approached with deliberately slow steps, as if fearing to startle her, until positioning its enormous muzzle inches from her extended hands. "He knows," murmured Lisa, caressing the animal. He always knew. Edward and Connie exchanged concerned looks, witnesses to a scene that defied rational comprehension. The connection between Lisa and the buffalo was almost palpable, as if they shared a silent language, inaccessible to others present. It was at that moment that Lisa emitted a sharp groan, doubling over her enormous belly. "The babies," she gasped between spasms of pain. "They're coming now." Panic took hold of Edward, who immediately ordered Connie, "Run to the house, bring clean towels, hot water, everything you can find." The housekeeper dashed toward the main house, while Edward desperately tried to comfort Lisa, who now breathed in broken gasps. "Let's take you back to the house," he said, trying to stay calm. "You can't have the babies here in the stable." "No," the response came with surprising firmness. "It has to be here with him." The stable, which for decades had served only as shelter for animals, had transformed into an improvised delivery room. On a bed of fresh straw covered with white sheets hastily brought from the main house, Lisa faced contractions that became increasingly frequent and intense. Edward, kneeling beside her, held her hand firmly, while Connie organized the towels and water she had managed to gather in record time. In the opposite corner of the stable, Chief remained motionless, its eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, like a silent sentinel guarding a sacred ritual. "The doctor must be on his way," Edward murmured repeatedly, like a mantra that could conjure professional help in the midst of this desperate situation. Lisa, between spasms of pain, maintained a disconcerting serenity. Her face, though contorted by physical suffering, exhibited an almost supernatural determination. "Everything will be fine," she whispered, in a moment of respite between contractions. They'll be born healthy. She guaranteed me. She who? Asked Edward, concerned about the possibility of feverish delirium. My mother, replied Lisa simply, before a new wave of pain made her arch her back. The alarmed look Edward exchanged, with Connie confirmed his fear. Lisa was delirious, confusing reality with the stories she had heard about her mother and the buffalo. Before he could say anything to calm her, however, he was interrupted by a sharp, inhuman sound coming from the corner of the stable. Chief had risen completely, its massive body casting an elongated shadow on the packed earth floor. The buffalo emitted that peculiar sound again, a kind of moan that none of those present had ever heard before. It's beginning, announced Lisa, with surprising clarity amid the pain. The babies are coming now. The words had barely left her lips when her body was shaken by a violent contraction. Connie, who had assisted numerous births on the ranch over decades, quickly positioned herself between Lisa's legs. I can see the first one's head, she announced, trying to keep her voice steady despite the visible astonishment on her face. I need you to push with the next contraction, Mrs. Lisa. What followed were moments of almost unbearable intensity. Edward, divided between supporting his wife and fear of the unknown that was about to come into the world, murmured words of encouragement, interspersed with fragmented prayers from his Catholic childhood. With a scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, Lisa gave birth to the first baby. The cry, surprisingly strong, echoed off the stable walls, causing a visible commotion in Chief, who approached a few steps as if drawn by an irresistible call. It's a boy, announced Connie, quickly wrapping the newborn in a clean towel. And he seems... Her voice failed, unable to complete the sentence. Seems what? Asked Edward, divided between fear and the need to know. Perfect, completed Lisa, extending her arms to receive her son. He is simply perfect. The baby, contrary to Edward's fears, had an entirely human appearance. His rosy skin and few strands of dark hair revealed nothing of the anomalies suggested by the medical examinations. His eyes, however, upon briefly opening, exhibited a disturbing intensity, an almost supernatural glow that made Edward instinctively recoil. There was no time for prolonged contemplation. The second contraction announced the imminent arrival of the other twin. Connie handed the first baby to Edward, who received him with a mixture of fear and wonder, and returned to her position to assist in the birth of the second child. The process was faster this time, as if the path were already prepared. With just 2 additional efforts, Lisa brought a girl into the world. Unlike her brother, the little one didn't cry immediately. Her silence caused seconds of terror in Edward, until Connie, with experienced movements, stimulated the newborn's first cry. A beautiful girl, announced the housekeeper, with tears in her eyes, healthy and strong like her brother. Lisa, exhausted by the effort of the twin birth, still found strength to smile as she received her daughter in her arms. Her face, though pale and covered with a thin layer of sweat, radiated a transcendental joy. Michael and Claire, she pronounced, looking alternately at the boy in Edward's arms and the girl she held. These are their names. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Claire was the name of Lisa's mother, the woman who, according to his father-in-law's diaries, had established some kind of mystical bond with Chief decades ago. Before he could comment on the choice of names, however, a movement in the corner of the stable caught his attention. Chief had approached even closer, its eyes fixed on the newborns, with a disturbing intensity. "Get that animal away," ordered Edward, instinctively protective. "Connie, take him outside." "No," intervened Lisa, her voice surprisingly firm for someone who had just given birth. "He needs to meet them. It's important." There was such authority in her words that neither Edward nor Connie dared to contest. With deliberately slow steps, the buffalo approached the improvised bed where Lisa rested with the twins. What happened next would forever defy Edward's rational comprehension. Chief lowered its massive head until its muzzle almost touched the babies. For a few seconds, time seemed suspended. An absolute silence took hold of the stable, as if all of nature held its breath. Then the buffalo's eyes, those same eyes that for years had observed Lisa with disconcerting intelligence, seemed to transform. For a brief moment, Edward swore. He saw in them a human glow, a consciousness that transcended animal nature. The babies, as if responding to a silent call, simultaneously extended their tiny hands toward the buffalo's muzzle. The contact lasted only an instant, but it was enough for Edward to witness something inexplicable. A subtle tremor ran through the animal's body, like an electric current, before it slowly retreated to its corner, where it lay down with renewed placidity. "It is done," murmured Lisa with an enigmatic smile. "The cycle is complete." "What does that mean?" asked Edward, confused and disturbed by what he had just witnessed. Lisa didn't respond immediately. Her gaze, which for a moment had seemed distant, as if contemplating realities inaccessible to others, turned to her husband with infinite tenderness. "It means they will be protected," she finally said. "That part of me will remain with them, even when I depart." The words, pronounced with serene acceptance, provoked a wave of despair in Edward. "Don't talk like that," he implored, holding his wife's free hand. "You just gave birth. You need to rest, recover your strength. As soon as Dr. Samuel arrived—" "There won't be time, my love," she interrupted, with a certainty that terrified him. "But it's all right. I've fulfilled my purpose. Our children will live, carrying within them not just our love, but also the connection to something greater, something we can't fully understand." Lisa's breathing became increasingly weak, as if each word cost her a monumental effort. "Promise you'll love them and protect them," she asked, her eyes fixed on Edward's, though she couldn't see him. "Promise you'll teach them about me, about my mother, about Chief. They'll need to understand where they came from to know who they are." "I promise," replied Edward, tears now flowing freely down his face. "But you'll be here to do this with me. You'll be fine, Lisa. You have to be." A serene smile illuminated Lisa's face for the last time. "This is just a transformation, my love, not an end," she whispered, her words almost inaudible. "I'll always be with you, in a way you don't yet understand." Her eyes, which throughout life had been deprived of physical vision, suddenly seemed illuminated by an inner clarity. For a fleeting moment, Lisa seemed to see beyond the veil that separates worlds. "It's so beautiful," she murmured, before her breathing became increasingly sparse. Dr. Samuel arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by Josh. Upon entering the stable and quickly assessing the situation, the doctor understood he had arrived too late for Lisa, but in time to examine the newborns. To his absolute astonishment, the children were perfectly healthy and showed no sign of the anomalies detected in previous examinations. The peculiar bone structures, the atypical cranial formations, everything had disappeared as if they had never existed. "This is scientifically inexplicable," declared the doctor, after thoroughly examining the twins. "I've never seen anything like it in my entire career." Edward, still in a state of shock from the loss of his wife, held the babies against his chest, unable to articulate a coherent response. It was Josh who finally broke the oppressive silence. "There are things in this world that science still can't explain, Doctor. Things we need to accept with faith and respect." In the days that followed, Pineville witnessed two notable events: Lisa's funeral, conducted with the solemn dignity she deserved, and the official presentation of the twins to the community. The same residents who had previously spread malicious rumors now bowed with respect before Edward's grief and Lisa's memory. As for Chief, the old buffalo remained on the ranch under Josh's special care. Edward noticed, with a mixture of fascination and unease, how the animal always seemed attentive to the twins. When the children cried, even at a distance, Chief became agitated. When they were happy, he seemed to share in the joy, as if an invisible connection united them. As the months passed and the twins grew with surprising vigor, Edward began to notice small details that confirmed Lisa's final words. The way Claire tilted her head when listening to music, exactly as her mother did. How Michael, still a baby, already demonstrated extraordinary spatial perception, as if his vision compensated for what his mother had lacked. On a quiet night, when the twins had just turned 1 year old, Edward sat on the main house's porch, observing the stars that dotted Pineville's sky. Beside him, in a specially constructed double swing, Michael and Claire slept serenely. From the stable came the gentle sound of Chief, a rhythmic snorting that always seemed to calm the children. Edward smiled, finally at peace with the mystery surrounding his family. "You kept your promise, Lisa," he said aloud as if she could hear him. "Part of you remains with them, with all of us." A gentle breeze stirred the garden leaves, bringing with it the aroma of jasmine that Lisa had so loved. Edward closed his eyes, allowing himself for a moment to believe that she was there, enveloping them with her love that transcended the barriers of physical existence. The cycle was complete. Life, in its infinite wisdom, had found a way to perpetuate itself beyond the limits of human understanding, and at the center of this extraordinary journey was love, the most powerful and mysterious force of all, capable of creating bridges between worlds and transforming the impossible into reality. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from.